Good afternoon. So I am Scott Helfstein.
Oh, turn it on. It's got to be green.
On?
There you go.
There we go. Okay, we'll just leave it on.
Yep.
So Scott Helfstein, I am the head of investment strategy for Global X ETFs. And I know at a family office event, you're probably asking yourselves, why is an ETF guy sitting here talking? And Marty's going to explain that to me at some point.
Again, I think it's because you guys are an excellent hedge for a lot of the stuff that we do. We actually have done a lot of early investing in new trends. And when I spoke to Christine from your firm, I think 8 of the things that she described is stuff that we got into really early. And you know, what you, from our point of view, is you offer a public way to hedge our private investments. So
we actually were out front. So just by way of background, so Global X, we're about a $50 billion issuer. I was at a conference in Miami last week where a private equity guy, I spoke before him, and he was actually paying me a compliment, but he was like, I didn't think there was that smart guys in the ETF landscape or ETFs were that smart, to which I simply say, well, it's tax efficient, it's liquid. So, hey, what could go wrong? But we're known actually in 3 areas for the most part. Our first is thematic growth, which is what we're here to talk about. We launched the first thematic fund back in 2010, which was lithium and battery technology. It was not about cars. It was about these things. So it took a little time. Some themes do. But we're also the first, for example, to launch with artificial intelligence back in 2018. So I think well before a lot of people were investing, and I had my mother invested in NVIDIA in 2017. So I'm still the favorite child.
what a son.
Our second area is alternative income. So we make things like covered call strategies, systematic, very simple and accessible to people. So you don't necessarily need your structured desks to do all that. And then finally, international access, places that's hard to get to. For example, our first fund was Colombia, but we have one of the only publicly traded Argentina funds, Greece. And so also some of the commodities that are a little harder to get at as well.
So I'm going to go down one path that was laid out for me, and then we'll get to the other path of your growth strategy afterwards.
Sure.
So, I guess that looking at defense today, the world is kind of a fire, right? And lots of stuff is going on. People are spending more and more money on defense. Can you talk to us about like the broader context of national security and Department of Defense and things like that? As a matter of fact, we've had ARPA and DARPA present to us many times in the last couple of years. InQtel presented to us. So can you talk about what's going on in geopolitics relative to investing?
Sure. I should probably, though, provide some bona fides for a minute, so I don't sound like I'm talking completely out of school. So after starting my career in finance, I did a master's degree in war studies at King's College, and then a PhD in public policy and behavioral economics at Michigan. I then went on faculty and I taught for 6 years at West Point in economics and international politics, and I was the research director for the Army's Combating Terrorism Center.
Wow.
So I have been inside the beast, if you will. I have deployed. I have worked in the intelligence agencies, worked with the State Department, Treasury, essentially every single player within the space you can imagine. I will also say that when I transitioned back into finance, I was looked at as a geopolitical analyst when I first kind of made that move. And the problem with that for me is I think geopolitics is a terrible investment thesis. It's awful, right? Markets go up. Geopolitics happens and markets go up. I would much rather invest on economics and fundamentals than geopolitics. What I can say, however, and what we put in our mid-year outlook is that we think that the source of volatility in public markets, therefore all markets, we think the source of volatility is switching from monetary policy volatility to geopolitical volatility based on what's going on in the world. And so the real kind of high-level backdrop is that the United States and its allies have not seen this type of pressure or rivalry since the Cold War. For the first time in at least 40 years, the United States, and arguably since 1973, the United States is facing pressure on 4 fronts simultaneously, right? Obviously, relations with China are not good. We don't necessarily expect them to get better. We can talk about some of those details, but Xi's first real decade go, similar like Putin's first decade, was all about, delivering on the economic miracle, and that's great, but that gets really hard to sustain for 20 years. And just as Putin turned nationalist, as Xi is bumping up against headwinds in his economy, we're seeing him get increasingly nationalist as well. That obviously complicates matters for Taiwan because it's going to be 3 to 5 years before we get any of these new US chip factories up and running. So this is a major issue for us.
So from an investment point of view, I mean, are we investing in companies that are offshoring their chips from Taiwan to the United States or nearshoring, or what's your perspective?
Taiwan currently supplies 80% of the high-end chips to the US market. So we are deeply, deeply reliant. I think it's, 60% of high-end chips, 80% of all chips. We are deeply reliant on the Taiwanese production process right now. If that were to get cut off, that would be a massive problem, not just for our military and some of the things we're going to talk about, but for our technology sector and everything related to that, which, let's face it, is the rest of the economy.
Okay.
So it is a major issue. I don't know if you want to, do you want to wait?
I don't know. Is it going to be a good question, Steve, that can be answered quickly? Fine. Okay. We keep.
One geopolitical analyst said the first thing happened, China goes into Taiwan, we said bomb would destroy all the Taiwanese manufacturing. What's your opinion about something? Suggested, but it's something that people said, whoa.
Well, look, in theory, we were sending more carrier groups over to the Pacific before I didn't get to South America yet, before we decided to send one down to South America. So our attempt really was to deter that ultimate outcome. I mean, if the Chinese take it, it sort of doesn't matter whether we bomb or not, because we're not going to get them, or at least we're not going to get them in the amounts that we need. So I mean, maybe somewhere on the shelf, somebody has created that plan. I think every meaningful step is going to be made to keep us from getting to that point. Because once we've gotten to that point, it doesn't matter whether they're there or not. It's not really. It took us way too long to get the CHIPS Act. It's actually great policy, right? 300 billion of public, 300 billion, right? 300 billion that has to match it private, which, by the way, we've only spent about 2%. So there's a ton of spending that's going to be coming down the pipe still. But we needed that 5 years ago. So
you talked about this carrier group that's in South America. We've got a couple of carrier groups in the Middle East.
well, so we've got so if we keep going right closer to home, obviously the war in the Middle East, right, and what's happened in Gaza, tremendous, just very, very difficult situation. But obviously then there's the Iranian component tied to that, Hezbollah as well. Obviously they were supporting Hamas. We'll get into connectivity in a minute, but you move over to Europe and we've got obviously the Ukraine war still going on. Russia, by the way, serves as a pivot point. So I think it's Ian Bremmer started using the phrase axis of disruption, right? It's kind of a play on the axis of evil back in the day after 9/11. But it really is this relationship between Russia, Iran, North Korea, and unfortunately now China as well. We've now seen Chinese weapons turn up in Ukraine, and the Defense Department is publicly acknowledging that, did a few months ago for the first time. And then closer to home, you have some activity in South America. A lot of people are not paying attention to, but Venezuela seized territory from neighboring Guyana. Guyana offshore is a major resource for Exxon, to the point where they actually built their own airport terminal in Guyana. The land that was seized is strategic in nature. It would actually give, if claimed, and Venezuela claims to have annexed it, even though no one really recognizes it. But if it was their territory, a significant amount of ExxonMobil assets would then fall under Venezuelan control. And therefore, instead of sending the USS George Washington Carrier Group to Japan, where it was supposed to go, we have routed it down to South America. And you might have noticed some news articles around Russian warships pulling into Havana Harbor for some exercises. For the record, by the way, Maduro very conveniently posted up some pictures of about, 4 or 5 weeks ago of his recent delivery of Iranian fast boats. So if we're curious about these relationships, they are really being put on full display. There's almost no effort at this point to kind of hide what's going on. And by the way, this is the first time the United States is pressured in this hemisphere in a very, very long time.
So we've got about 12 minutes. I just want to
Okay.
please be parsimonious in your questions, Steve.
Yeah, I would be anxious to hear your view on what I'm gonna ask you, but to give you a background on mine, so you know where I'm coming from. I was AI, 11 Special Forces, 10 Special Forces, and I was at the Army War College, so I have.
Thank you for your service.
That said, we are being forced into a position gradually where we're gonna have to take a reaction. A Churchillian approach doesn't make sense anymore. What do you see us doing in order to address what we're facing on a conflict basis worldwide now that's been created? Because the reaction has to be more severe than it ever would have been.
The problem is I don't know that we have any political leadership right now that actually has the interest, the incentive, or the courage to follow through on the type of response that you're talking about. I hate to say it, but that's unfortunately the world I think we live in. So I think it's a matter of playing whack-a-mole, and I think the Department of Defense will do everything they can to continue to work by, with, and through, as you are well familiar with. It's a Special Forces mantra, to try and keep the lid on everything as much as possible. But I agree with you. We actually need a more severe response, and seizing Maduro's jet isn't really going to get us there. But I don't see either of these political candidates actually taking a stand stronger than what we've already
I think
seen.
our general strategy as a group is avoidance, because we don't think anything's going to happen. You know, so next question, it's got to be brief again.
Again, looking forward. So just to give you some background, I do a lot of macro type of risk thinking. And in 2008, people got a lot of questions about what's going to happen to the dollar. My response was nothing. We have the most carrier groups in the world. We have 12 of them, right? And we protect global trade, and with the market of the world, people have to do business in dollars. This is weakening. The Navy's getting weaker and weaker. Is there any, how does that get reversed? Who is going to start building more carrier groups to respond to crises?
Well,
I have a couple of friends who have quit because of frustration.
So let me actually take the question to where I think we ultimately want to go,
thank you, please.
which is, I don't know that the future is more carrier groups.
Okay.
It's an automated future. It's about swarm submarine capabilities. It's about amphibious ships that can deploy autonomous vehicles, right, rapidly, that are fast, that can be deployed at scale, and that have significant amounts of flexibility, and that have much more intelligent targeting systems. A little bit like nuclear. I'm a big fan of like the nuclear complex to power AI and all the things that are going on, but we're not going to build more, Indian points, right, up the river. We're going to build small modular reactors, and we've been doing it on these ships for a long time. The future is not billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar warships. The future is faster, smaller, and smarter. And that's ultimately, so where I think Marty wants to go is one of the funds that we launched, actually our newest fund. It's reaching 1 year old this year, and it's already above $500 million, which for an ETF is remarkable, right? It puts it in like the top 1 or 2% for asset gathering, is defense technology, precisely around this. Because we are not like, China spends, we're spending what, about 800 billion on our 850 or so in the latest Defense Authorization Act. China's spending about 300 billion. The problem is on a purchasing parity basis, right? PPP, since you're an economist, people don't realize this. They're like, oh, we spend significantly more. On a PPP basis, they're almost outspending us. So are we really going to get into a race to say, let's build more and more of these humongous platforms, or are we going to say, how do we deliver lethally the blow that we need more efficiently? Well, that's actually why the war in Ukraine is so valuable to the Department of Defense right now. And it's why that they push very, very hard to maintain the funding, because it is in many ways the first automated war where we are using off-the-shelf technologies, which, by the way, Joe Votel at SOCOM talked about extensively during his time there. He talked about AI and off-the-shelf, right? And actually, he became the distinguished chair of the Combating Terrorism Center that I worked at and have maintained affiliation with. And so we've seen that happen, right? Ukraine is the case in point. How do you get smarter targeting, and how do you take technologies that were never even meant for military use, that were meant for civilian use, and put them into this type of platform? And that's why a lot of the investment that we're going to see isn't in trying to harden our ship, right? I mean, if the Chinese, which they have in their doctrine, that they're willing to use nuclear weapons on the seas against a U.S. carrier to prevent being blocked from Taiwan, if that's their going assumption, then what are we going to do to stop that? It's not build a bigger carrier. It's we need to be able to say, well, how can we identify those assets in the air? How can we use LiDAR to target them more efficiently? How can we use AI to cut down the amount of time to which it takes somebody to push a button, right? How can we use drones as a defensive blanket to potentially do that, as we're seeing with the Iron Dome in Israel? So there's a range of other technologies that we think are going to be critical.
And you've seen a lot of surprising outcomes from this war and from the Israel war, which is the, Starlink in Ukraine. You've seen the whole series of drones